Dust motes danced in the shafts of grey afternoon light, suspended over a sprawling Persian rug that smelled faintly of dog hair and stale ozone. Margot adjusted the heavy clipboard against her ribcage. The plastic edge dug a sharp line into her sternum, a grounding ache in an otherwise suffocating room. She was sweating through her silk blouse, a cheap imitation, bought on clearance, despite the aggressive, bone-deep chill of the Chicago penthouse. Lorenzo Moretti stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. He hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. Margot clicked her pen, the sharp plastic clack echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She was an estate liquidator, a glorified vulture hired to catalogue the remnants of dead or ruined men. Usually her clients were grieving widows or impatient bankers. Today it was Lorenzo. He didn't look like the caricatures of organized crime. There were no gaudy rings, no slicked-back hair. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over a lean frame, and he smelled faintly of cold rain and cedar. But the three men standing perfectly still by the mahogany double doors, men with thick necks and dead flat eyes, told her exactly what kind of room she was standing in. The credenza, Margot said, her voice rough. She cleared her throat, hating the slight tremor in it. Mid-century. Walnut. There's a water stain on the top left corner which will drop the auction reserve by about 15%. Lorenzo didn't turn from the window. He was watching the traffic crawl along Lakeshore Drive, his hands buried in his pockets. "Note it," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. Margot scribbled on the appraisal sheet. Her handwriting was jagged. She just wanted to finish this floor, collect her exorbitant hazard pay fee, and go home to her cramped apartment. She needed the money. That was the only reason she had ignored the knot of dread in her stomach when the agency handed her the Moretti file. Her phone buzzed against her hip. She ignored it, stepping toward a glass display case housing a collection of antique pocket watches. She leaned in, squinting at the maker's mark on a tarnished silver piece. The glass was smeared with fingerprints. The phone buzzed again. A long, sustained vibration. Then a pause. Then a third time. It was the emergency bypass ringtone. Margot froze. Her heart kicked against her ribs hard and fast. Only one place called with that specific urgency. The nursing care facility in Naples. "I apologize," Margot murmured, keeping her back to the room. "I need to silence this." She pulled the phone from her pocket. The cracked screen blared a familiar international number. Her thumb hovered over the red reject button. If she ignored it, they might discharge her grandmother. The facility was ruthless about missed payments and delayed authorizations. If she answered it, she was breaking the cardinal rule of her agency: never interrupt a high-tier client's time. She swiped green. She couldn't help it. Pressing the phone hard against her ear, she turned her face toward the dusty corner of the room, hunching her shoulders to muffle the sound. "Pronto," she whispered. A barrage of loud, aggressive Italian poured through the receiver. It was the facility administrator, Signora Rossi, her voice shrill and unforgiving. Margot squeezed her eyes shut. The headache that had been brewing at the base of her skull flared into a sharp, blinding throb. She pressed 2 fingers hard against her temple, feeling the oily residue of her morning makeup. "No ascolta," Margot hissed, her voice dropping an octave. She slipped effortlessly into the thick, guttural Campanian dialect of her childhood. It wasn't the lyrical, musical Italian of tourists. It was street-level rapid and hard-edged. "Ti ho detto che il bonifico arriva domani. Non puoi buttarla fuori. Ho I fottuti documenti che lo provano. I told you the wire clears tomorrow. You can't throw her out. I have the fucking paperwork to prove it." The woman on the other end barked a laugh, dismissing her. Margot's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white. The professional quiet estate liquidator vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered woman. She forgot the penthouse. She forgot the men at the door. "Stammi a sentire, brutta stronza." Margot snapped, her voice trembling, with a potent mix of exhaustion and rage. "Se le togliete le medicine stanotte, giuro su Dio che vi denuncio. I soldi ci sono. Aspetta 24 ore. Listen to me, you ugly bitch. If you take away her medication tonight, I swear to God, I'll report you. The money is there. Wait 24 hours. A brief, tense pause followed on the line. Signora Rossi muttered a curse, agreed to wait until the morning banking hours, and hung up. Margot let out a shaky breath. The silence in the penthouse rushed back in, suddenly deafening. She slowly lowered the phone. The air in the room felt different. Heavier. When she turned around, her apology dying on her lips, she found Lorenzo Moretti staring directly at her. He was no longer looking at the city. He had turned fully away from the window. His eyes, the color of bruised earth, were locked onto her face. The bored indifference was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory stillness. The 3 muscle-bound guards by the door had shifted their weight, their hands resting subtly nearer to their jackets, reacting to the sudden change in their boss's posture. Margot swallowed. Her mouth was completely dry. "I apologize, Mr. Moretti. A family medical emergency. It won't happen again." Lorenzo didn't blink. He looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against Margot's chest. He didn't speak. He just watched her breathe, analyzing the flush of anger still burning on her cheeks, the way her hands were shaking as she shoved the phone back into her pocket. He had understood every single word. Minutes dragged like hours after the phone call. Margot forced herself to walk toward a pair of heavily carved mahogany bookcases, her sensible flats sinking into the plush rug. Her legs felt like lead. She kept her eyes glued to the clipboard, pretending to examine the bindings of a leather-clad encyclopedia set. But the words blurred into meaningless black lines. Every tiny sound in the room was magnified. The distant wail of an ambulance on the street below. The hum of the penthouse's massive HVAC system kicking on, and the steady rhythmic scuff of leather shoes against the floorboards as Lorenzo slowly paced the length of the room. He was tracking her. He didn't ask about the call. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply altered his orbit to keep her in his direct line of sight. When she moved to the far corner to inspect a tarnished silver tea set, he drifted to the center island. "The silver is tarnished," Margot said, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space. She rubbed a thumb over the spout of a teapot, leaving a bright streak through the black oxidation. "But the hallmarks indicate it's 19th century buccellati. It will fetch a high price if polished." "Campagna," Lorenzo said. Margot froze. Her thumb slipped, scraping painfully against the sharp, decorative edge of the silver handle. "Excuse me," she asked, not looking up. "Your accent," Lorenzo continued, his voice, a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. "It's not just Campagna, it's specific. Avellino, or the hills just outside it." Margot gripped the edge of the table. The wood felt cold and solid under her damp palms. She didn't want to engage. Survival instinct told her to remain a faceless service worker. If you gave a predator a thread, they would pull until you unraveled. "My grandparents," Margot lied, keeping her tone professionally detached. "I learned it from them." "You swore like a dock worker," Lorenzo noted. It wasn't an insult. It was a factual observation, delivered with a strange, clinical fascination. People who learn Italian from their sweet grandparents don't threaten to ruin administrators with that kind of fluency. Margot finally looked up. Lorenzo was closer than he had been a moment ago. The proximity made her skin prickle. Up close, she could see the faint, silvery scar cutting through his left eyebrow and the dark circles of chronic exhaustion beneath his eyes. He didn't look angry. He looked hungry. Not in a sexual way, but in the way a man dying of thirst looks at a glass of water. It was terrifying. "I'm very protective of my family, Mr. Moretti," she said quietly. She capped her pen, the sharp click, signaling the end of her patience. "That concludes the ground floor inventory. I have everything I need to draft the preliminary estate value." Lorenzo stared at her for a long, agonizing beat. "We haven't finished the upstairs. The agency only contracted me for the main living areas today. My scheduled time was up 10 minutes ago." Margot shoved her clipboard into her worn leather tote bag. The zipper snagged on a loose thread, and she yanked it violently, nearly tearing the fabric. She was losing her composure. She just needed the elevator doors to close between them. She hoisted the bag onto her shoulder. "The preliminary report will be emailed to your attorney by Tuesday. Have a good afternoon." She didn't wait for him to dismiss her. She turned and walked toward the private elevator vestibule at the far end of the hall. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her sternum. "Just keep walking. Heel toe. Don't run." The 3 men at the door watched her approach. They didn't step aside immediately. Margot slowed her pace, her jaw clenching. "Excuse me," she said to the tallest one, a man with a ruined boxer's nose. He looked over her head, waiting for a signal. From the center of the room, Lorenzo spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. He spoke to the man with the ruined nose, his tone as casual as if he were ordering a coffee. "Victor, don't let her leave." Margot's breath hitched in her throat. The world tilted on its axis for a microsecond. Before she could process the command, Victor moved. He didn't draw a weapon or grab her violently. He simply stepped completely into her path, a human wall of muscle and dark wool blocking the brass elevator doors. The smell of peppermint gum and gun oil washed over her. Panic, cold and sharp as cracked ice, flooded Margot's veins. "What are you doing?" She snapped, the professional veneer shattering instantly. She took a step back, her hand flying to the strap of her bag like a shield. She looked past Victor, locking eyes with Lorenzo. "My agency knows I'm here. My GPS is tracked. You can't just... I can do whatever I want, Margot," Lorenzo said. He was walking toward her now, his footsteps slow, deliberate. She hadn't told him her first name. It was on the agency paperwork, yes, but hearing it in his mouth made her stomach drop into her shoes. "I have a schedule." She lied, her voice cracking halfway through the sentence. She hated herself for the crack. She wanted to sound brave, defiant. Instead, she sounded exactly like what she was, a civilian, trapped in a room with monsters. "I have another appointment." "Cancel it," Lorenzo said. He stopped 3 feet away from her. The height difference was staggering. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "I won't," she breathed, her chest heaving. "Move your man, Mr. Moretti. Now." Lorenzo tilted his head slightly, studying the frantic pulse jumping at the base of her throat. He reached into his jacket pocket. Margot flinched, bracing herself, but he only pulled out a sleek black smartphone. "You owe a facility in Naples 12,000 euros in back pay for an Alzheimer's patient," Lorenzo said softly, reading from a message on his screen. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers, pinning her in place. "Your bank account has $300 in it. The wire you promised that woman on the phone doesn't exist." Margot felt the blood drain from her face. Her legs went completely numb. He had pulled her financial life apart in the 10 minutes since she hung up the phone. "Who are you?" she whispered, the fight leaking out of her, replaced by a hollow, yawning terror. Lorenzo stepped closer, encroaching on her personal space. The scent of cedar and cold rain enveloped her. "I'm the man who just bought your debt," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, meant only for her. "Which means you aren't leaving until we discuss exactly how you're going to pay me back." Nausea hit her first. It was a cold, heavy stone dropping directly into her lower stomach, bringing with it a sudden metallic taste in the back of her mouth. Margot stood paralyzed. The brass elevator doors behind Victor's massive shoulder reflected a warped, distorted version of her own face. Pale, wide-eyed, completely stripped of the professional mask she had spent years perfecting. 12,000 euros. It was a number that had haunted her sleep for 6 months. She had sold her car, downsized her apartment, and pawned her mother's wedding ring to keep the Naples facility at bay. She had lied on the phone just 20 minutes ago, bluffing with a wire transfer she knew she couldn't back up, praying for a clerical error or a sympathetic weekend nurse to buy her 3 more days. Lorenzo Moretti had dismantled her entire life's struggle in the time it took her to walk 30 feet across a room. "My bank accounts are private," Margot managed to say. Her voice sounded detached, like it was coming from someone else, standing a few feet away. She couldn't draw a full breath. The air in the penthouse felt thick, saturated with the faint, metallic scent of the street below and the sharp tang of Lorenzo's cologne. "Nothing is private," Lorenzo said. He slipped the phone back into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The movement was smooth, practiced. He didn't look triumphant. There was no smirk, no gloating. That made it infinitely worse. He was simply stating facts, arranging the pieces on a board only he could see. "Your grandmother Rosa, room 412, advanced Alzheimer's. The facility was preparing the discharge papers while you were appraising my grandfather's pocket watches." Margot's fingers dug into the stiff leather strap of her tote bag until her nails ached. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the heavy bag at his face and bolt for the fire stairs. But her legs felt like they were packed with wet sand. The reality of the situation was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. If she ran, if she somehow made it past the men at the door, Rosa would be out on the street in a city she no longer recognized, her mind fractured and alone. "What do you want?" Margot asked. The words scraped against her dry throat. Lorenzo turned away from her, breaking the intense eye contact. He walked slowly toward a massive leather Chesterfield sofa in the center of the room. He sat down, unbuttoning his jacket with one hand, and gestured to the matching armchair opposite him. "Sit." It wasn't a request. Margot looked at Victor. The guard hadn't moved an inch. He was staring straight ahead, chewing his gum with a slow, mechanical rhythm. There was no escape. She pulled her bag tighter against her side, treating it like a shield, and forced her feet to move. Her flats made no sound on the thick Persian rug. She perched on the very edge of the armchair. The leather groaned softly under her weight. It smelled of old cigars and lemon polish. She kept her knees pressed tightly together, her back rigid. "I don't have money," Margot said, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempts to control it. "You saw the account. If this is a robbery or some kind of extortion, you have the wrong person. I'm an appraiser. I make $55,000 a year." Lorenzo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He clasped his hands loosely together. His knuckles were raw, the skin split and healing in jagged lines. Margot's eyes locked onto those cuts. They were violent, ugly marks on an otherwise immaculate man. "I don't want your money, Margot," he said quietly. "I have more money than God. What I don't have is someone who speaks the exact localized dialect of the Avellino Hill country. A dialect so isolated that my standard translators in New York and Chicago miss half the context, the idioms, the buried threats. Margot blinked her brain, struggling to catch up. You held me hostage for a translator gig. I retained your services, Lorenzo corrected smoothly. You threatened me. I secured your undivided attention. He watched her chest heave with ragged breaths. 2 weeks ago, my uncle died. This penthouse, the assets you're appraising, they were his. He also left behind a very specific set of handwritten ledgers and a series of recorded phone calls. The men he was dealing with operate out of Campania. They speak the way you spoke on the phone. Margot shook her head, a short, jerky movement. No. No, absolutely not. I appraise furniture. I deal in dead people's couches, Mr. Moretti. I don't translate mob ledgers. You do now. I will go to the police. Lorenzo let out a soft, breathy sound that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. He leaned back against the sofa, letting the shadows of the room swallow the sharp angles of his face. Go ahead. Walk out that door and find a uniform. Tell them Lorenzo Moretti forced you to sit in a chair and offered you a job. They'll take your statement. And then tomorrow morning, Rosa will be sitting on the curb outside her clinic with a trash bag full of her clothes. The fight drained out of Margot in a rush. Her shoulders slumped. A deeply buried, treacherous part of her mind, the part exhausted by months of panic attacks and overdraft fees, whispered a dark thought. He can pay for it. He can fix it. She hated herself for thinking it. She dug her fingernails into her palm to ground herself. Why me? She whispered, staring at the floorboards between his expensive shoes. There are thousands of people in this city who speak Italian. Because you didn't learn it in a classroom, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping, taking on a rougher texture. You learned it in the dirt. You learned the ugly version of it. I heard you on that phone. You understand desperation, Margot. You understand how people talk when their backs are against a wall. That's what I need to read in those ledgers. I need to know exactly how desperate these men are. Shadows began to lengthen across the Persian rug, turning the faded red wool the color of dried blood. The silence in the penthouse stretched thick and suffocating. Margot stared at the raw, split knuckles of Lorenzo's hands, her mind spinning like a car engine, trying to turn over in the dead of winter. She was trapped. The realization didn't come with fireworks or sudden tears. It settled into her bones like a deep ache. Lorenzo stood up. The sudden movement made Margot flinch, her shoulders jerking upward. He noticed his eyes narrowing fractionally, but he didn't comment. He walked over to a built-in wet bar tucked beneath a sweeping modern staircase. The clink of crystal against glass cut through the quiet room. He poured an amber liquid from a heavy decanter, the sound crisp and sharp. Do you want one? He asked, not turning around. No, Margot said. Her voice was flat. I want to leave. He walked back and set a glass of water on the low table between them. Condensation beaded on the outside of the glass, pooling on the dark wood. He took a slow sip from his own tumbler of whiskey. The debt is cleared, Lorenzo said. Margot stopped breathing. She stared at him, uncomprehending. I wired the 12,000 euros to the facility 10 minutes ago. Lorenzo continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. The administrator, Signora Rossi, it was very accommodating once the funds hit their escrow account. Rosa is secure for the next year, paid in full. A violent cocktail of emotion erupted in Margot's chest. Relief so intense it made her dizzy, crashed into a wall of absolute terror. He had paid it. Her grandmother was safe. The crushing weight that had been drowning her for half a year vanished in an instant, only to be replaced by a new, infinitely more dangerous chain wrapped tight around her neck. "You can't do that," she choked out. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and unbidden. She swiped at them furiously with the back of her hand, hating the show of weakness. "You didn't have my permission." "I didn't need it," Lorenzo said. He set his glass down. "You were lying to them. You had no way to pay it. I solved a problem for you. Now you are going to solve a problem for me." "I didn't ask for your help," Margot's voice cracked, rising in pitch. The facade broke entirely. She stood up, her legs trembling so badly she had to brace her hand against the armrest. "You bought me. You bought me like one of your grandfather's stupid pocket watches." Lorenzo didn't move. He absorbed her anger with infuriating stillness. He looked up at her, his dark eyes tracking the frantic pulse at her throat. "I bought your time," he corrected softly. 50 hours. That's all I need. You will sit in my office, you will listen to the tapes, and you will translate the ledgers. You will tell me exactly what these men are planning, using the context only someone from your specific background understands. And if I refuse, Margot demanded, her chest heaving, if I walk out right now, you won't. You don't know me. Lorenzo leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The distance between them vanished, the sheer physical presence of him overwhelming the space. "I know that a woman who screams at a clinic administrator in street gutter Italian to protect a sick old lady isn't going to throw away a year of paid medical care out of pride. You love her more than you value your own comfort. I respect that. It makes you reliable." Margot closed her eyes. A single tear slipped free, cutting a hot path down her cheek. He was right. That was the most sickening part of it all. He had found her one singular vulnerability, and he had wrapped his hands around it with surgical precision. She opened her eyes, focusing on the glass of water. Her mouth was painfully dry. She reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up, taking a small, desperate sip. The water was ice-cold, shocking her system. "I don't know anything about your world," Margot said, her voice dropping to a defeated whisper. She stared at the water in the glass, watching her own hands shake. "I appraise wood and silver. If I mistranslate something, if I get it wrong—" "You won't get it wrong," Lorenzo said, "because you know the stakes." He stood up, towering over her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key, tossing it onto the table beside her half-empty water glass. It landed with a dull thud. "That's for the private elevator," Lorenzo said. "You'll be here tomorrow at 8 in the morning. My driver will pick you up from your apartment in Logan Square. Don't make him wait in the cold." Margot stared at the key. It looked like a trap resting on the mahogany surface. "My agency has already been informed that you were requested for a long-term exclusive inventory project. Your boss was thrilled. The retainer I paid them ensures they won't ask any questions." Lorenzo adjusted the cuffs of his suit. "Victor will walk you out." He turned his back on her and walked toward the far end of the penthouse, disappearing into the shadows of a hallway. Margot stood alone in the center of the vast room. The air conditioning kicked on, sending a draft across the back of her damp neck. She looked toward the brass elevator doors. Victor had stepped aside, leaving the path clear. The cage was open. She slowly reached down her cold fingers, closing around the heavy brass key. It felt like holding a live coal. She dropped it into a tote bag, the metal clinking against her pens, and walked toward the exit, knowing with terrifying certainty that her old life had just ended. Morning broke over Logan Square in bruised shades of purple and grey, filtering through the cheap plastic blinds of Margot's apartment. She hadn't slept. Her eyes burned dry and gritty as she stood by the cramped kitchen window, holding a mug of lukewarm tap water. The radiator in the corner hissed a metallic, rhythmic spit that usually comforted her with its predictability. Today, it just sounded like a countdown. She was dressed in her best professional armor, a charcoal turtleneck, heavy black slacks, and a structured blazer. It was the outfit she wore when dealing with hostile bank executors, designed to make her look older and severely unapproachable. Staring at her pale reflection in the microwave door, she knew the clothes wouldn't work on Lorenzo Moretti. He had already seen the terrified, desperate woman underneath. At precisely 7:45, a sleek, black Lincoln Navigator pulled to the curb below. It didn't honk. It simply sat there, a heavy, idling beast, exhaling white exhaust into the freezing Chicago air. Margot swallowed the rest of her water. It tasted faintly of old copper pipes. She picked up her leather tote bag, feeling the dead weight of the brass key resting at the bottom. She didn't leave a note. There was no one to leave a note for. The driver didn't speak when she opened the rear door. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that strained across his back, and he kept his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror until she clicked her seatbelt into place. The interior of the SUV smelled of expensive chemical leather cleaner and a faint, lingering trace of cigarette smoke. The privacy partition behind the front seats was already raised. Traffic on the Kennedy Expressway was a crawling nightmare, but the isolation inside the cabin made the city outside feel like a muted movie. Margot kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her fingernails digging half-moons into her own palms. She tried to mentally review her appraisal notes from yesterday, desperately trying to cling to the mundane reality of her actual job, but her brain refused to cooperate. All she could hear was the harsh, guttural echo of Lorenzo's voice. "I bought your time." They bypassed the main entrance of the downtown high-rise entirely. The driver navigated down a ramp into a subterranean parking structure, swiping a keycard that opened a heavy, unmarked steel gate. He parked next to a row of concrete pillars. "The elevator is through that grey door, miss," the driver finally said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Use the key." Margot stepped out. The underground air was freezing and smelled of motor oil and damp concrete. Her sensible heels clicked loudly, echoing off the low ceiling as she walked toward the featureless grey door. It opened into a small, brutally sterile vestibule containing a single brass-trimmed elevator. She dug into her bag, her fingers clumsy and numb. The brass key slid into the lock panel beneath the call button. It turned with a heavy oiled click that sent a vibration up her arm. The doors parted immediately. There were no buttons inside the car. The moment she stepped in, the doors sealed shut, and the elevator began to rise. It moved with terrifying speed, dropping her stomach, yet perfectly smooth. When the doors opened again, she wasn't in the airy, sunlit penthouse from yesterday. This floor was a fortress. The walls were clad in dark, sound-absorbing acoustic panels. The floor was polished concrete, poured and sealed to a mirror finish. Fluorescent lights humming with a low, barely perceptible frequency cast a harsh, clinical glow over banks of computer servers encased in glass down the left hallway. To the right, a set of heavy, frosted glass doors stood partially open. Margot walked toward them, her pulse hammering in her throat. Lorenzo was waiting inside. The room was a massive office, stripped of any personal touches. No photos, no art, just a sprawling black glass desk, multiple encrypted monitors, and a wall of whiteboards covered in sharp, jagged handwriting. He was standing by an espresso machine in the corner, holding a small ceramic cup. He wore dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing the thick cords of muscle and the faded edge of a dark tattoo snaking up his left wrist. He looked up as she crossed the threshold. "You're exactly on time," Lorenzo noted. He didn't smile. He set the cup down. "I appreciate punctuality. I didn't have much of a choice," Margot replied. Her voice was steady, a small victory that cost her an immense amount of internal effort. Lorenzo's dark eyes swept over her, taking in the severe turtleneck and the rigid set of her shoulders. He walked to the center desk and tapped his knuckles against a stack of worn, leather-bound notebooks. Next to them sat a high-end digital audio interface and a pair of heavy studio-grade headphones. "My Uncle Carlo ran the import logistics for our family for 40 years. Lorenzo said, his tone entirely strictly business. He wasn't posturing. He was delivering a briefing. 3 years ago, he started negotiating independent contracts with a Camorra faction operating out of the hills near Avellino. He thought he was building a private retirement fund. Instead, they bled him dry, cornered his supply lines. And then 2 weeks ago, they put a bullet in his chest outside a restaurant in Cicero." Margot felt a cold sweat break out along her hairline. The bluntness of the murder delivered so casually stripped away the last delusion that this was just a high-stakes corporate gig. She was standing in the middle of a war room. "I don't need to know this," Margot whispered, taking a step back. "Please, I'll translate the words. Don't tell me the rest. You need context to translate accurately," Lorenzo countered smoothly, his gaze pinning her in place. "These men don't speak plainly. They use code. They use regional slang to obscure shipments, money drops, and hits. My standard translators gave me 50 pages of transcripts about olive oil shipments and construction delays. I know it's garbage. You're going to listen to the audio files, read Carlo's ledgers, and tell me what they are actually saying." He pulled out a heavy leather chair behind the desk. "Sit down, Margot. Put the headphones on. Your 50 hours starts now." Static crackled through the heavy noise-cancelling headphones, a harsh electric hiss that made Margot flinch. She adjusted the padded band over her ears, her fingers trembling slightly. The black glass desk beneath her forearms was freezing, seeping a deep chill right through the wool of her blazer. Lorenzo sat directly across from her. He had pulled up a secondary chair, leaning back, with his ankle crossed over his knee. He wasn't looking at the screens. He was watching her. The intensity of his focus felt like a physical weight pressing against the side of her face. Margot clicked the spacebar on the keyboard. The first audio file began to play. It was a recording from a wiretap or a bugged room. The sound quality was muffled, layered with background noise. She heard the clinking of cheap glassware, the scrape of a wooden chair against a tile floor, and the distant rhythmic hum of a Vespa engine. And then the voices started. Margot's breath hitched. The dialect hit her like a physical blow to the chest. It was the exact harsh cadence of the men who used to smoke outside the butcher shop in her grandmother's village. It wasn't the romanticized melodic Italian of cinema. It was thick, swallowed vowels and clipped consonants spat out with aggressive, casual cruelty. It smelled in her memory of stale beer, cured pork and damp earth. "L'olio è rancido," a raspy voice complained on the tape. "The oil is rancid. Digli a quel vecchio bastardo che se non manda il nuovo carico bruciamo il frantoio. Tell that old bastard if he doesn't send the new shipment, we'll burn the olive press." Margot paused to the audio. She looked down at the printed transcript Lorenzo's previous team had provided. It read exactly as the words translated literally, a complaint about spoiled agricultural products and a threat to destroy a farming facility. She slowly reached for a red pen. Her hand shook, but as the ink met the paper, the professional analytical part of her brain, the part that could date a mahogany veneer by touch alone, kicked in. It was a defense mechanism. If she treated this like an appraisal, a puzzle of language rather than a map of murder, she wouldn't fall apart. "They aren't talking about olive oil," Margot said, her voice cracking slightly in the quiet room. She cleared her throat and tried again, projecting more volume. The previous translator took it literally. Lorenzo sat forward, the casual posture vanishing instantly. He rested his elbows on the desk. "Explain. In the Avellino Hills, olio rancido, rancid oil, is street slang for money that has been marked or money drawn from a frozen account. It means heat. Police attention." Margot dragged the red pen through the printed text, crossing it out with a violent slash. "They are telling your uncle that the last payment he sent was traceable." Lorenzo didn't move, his eyes narrowed, absorbing the information. "And the olive press, the frantoio. It's not a press," Margot said, staring at the notebook. Her stomach churned. In this specific context, it means the source, the bank, or the person authorizing the transfers. She looked up, meeting his bruised earth eyes. "They weren't threatening a farm, Mr. Moretti. They were telling your uncle that if he didn't send clean, untraceable cash, they were going to come to Chicago and kill whoever was running his books." Silence stretched between them, thick and electric. Lorenzo looked at the red ink bleeding into the cheap paper of the transcript. He exhaled slowly, a long, measured breath through his nose. He didn't look surprised. He looked validated. The dangerous, simmering tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just a predator and his captive. It was a predator realizing his captive had extremely sharp teeth. "Play the next section." Lorenzo ordered, his voice dropping an octave, practically a rumble in his chest. Margot pressed the spacebar. For the next 3 hours they didn't stop. The work was grueling. Margot listened to the tapes, cross-referencing the dates with Carlo's handwritten ledgers. She lived entirely inside the headphones, decoding a terrifying world of extortion, bribery, and violence, wrapped in the mundane vocabulary of plumbing repairs, stray dogs, and weather patterns. "I cane randagi hanno fame," the raspy voice said on tape 3. "The stray dogs are hungry." "Untraceable couriers," Margot murmured, rubbing her aching temples. She scribbled the translation into the margins of the ledger. "They want the couriers paid a higher premium." Lorenzo was a silent, looming presence. He anticipated her needs with unnerving precision. When she reached blindly for her empty water glass, he replaced it with a fresh, ice-cold one before she even fully opened her eyes. When she rubbed the back of her stiff neck, he adjusted the ambient temperature of the room from a digital panel on his phone. It was an intimate, highly observant kind of care, entirely at odds with the fact that he was keeping her there against her will. By noon, Margot's brain felt like it was packed with cotton. She hit pause and pulled the headphones down, letting them rest around her neck. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting off a brewing migraine. "Take a break," Lorenzo said. Margot opened her eyes. He was standing right next to her chair. She hadn't even heard him move. The scent of cedar and cold rain washed over her, grounding her instantly in the sterile office. He placed a small ceramic plate on the desk next to her keyboard. On it was a simple, perfectly made espresso and a piece of dark chocolate. "I don't want anything from you," Margot said stubbornly, staring straight ahead at the monitors. "You're shaking," Lorenzo pointed out. His tone was infuriatingly calm. "Your blood sugar is crashing. You can hate me, Margot, but you can't translate if you pass out. Drink the coffee." She looked at his hands. The knuckles were still raw and split. She realized with a sudden jarring clarity that the men on the tapes, the men threatening to burn and bleed his family, were the targets of whatever violence those hands had recently committed. A terrifying contradiction warred inside her. She despised him for dragging her into this darkness, for using Rosa's life as leverage. But as she looked at the espresso, a small, dark part of her, the part tired of being stepped on by banks and administrators, felt a perverse thrill at being the one to hand Lorenzo the matches he would use to burn those men to the ground. Margot picked up the espresso cup. Her hand was indeed trembling. She took a sip. It was bitter scalding and perfect. "Tape 4, she said, her voice hard. She didn't look at him as she pulled the headphones back over her ears. "Let's finish the month of October." Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the office window, driven hard by the freezing winds coming off Lake Michigan. Inside the soundproof room, the storm was nothing but a dull, rhythmic thud. Margot sat hunched over the black glass desk, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her bloodshot eyes. It was past 8 in the evening. Her back screamed in protest, a knot of tension burning between her shoulder blades. She had been translating for 10 hours straight. Lorenzo had barely moved. He operated with a terrifying mechanical endurance. Throughout the afternoon, his men had come and gone in silence, handing him manila folders or leaning in to whisper updates. He processed the information, instantly issuing low monosyllabic commands before returning his absolute suffocating attention to Margot and her notebook. She paused the 10th audio file, her finger hovering over the spacebar. The silence in her headphones felt heavy, ringing slightly from the awful audio compression of the wiretaps. "Something is wrong with this one," Margot said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual professional polish. Lorenzo set down the pen he had been turning between his scarred fingers. He leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking. "Wrong how the audio quality?" "No, the voices." Margot pulled one side of the headphones off her ear, needing to hear the reality of the room to ground herself. "The primary speaker is the same man from the October recordings, the one from Campania. But the second voice, he's speaking Italian, but the cadence is completely wrong. He's translating American idioms directly into the dialect. It sounds rehearsed." Lorenzo's expression didn't change, but his stillness deepened. It was the absolute stillness of a snake preparing to strike. "Play it on the speakers." Margot unplugged the audio jack. She hit the spacebar. The harsh, static-laced recording filled the sterile office. 2 men were talking over the clatter of what sounded like a busy kitchen. The Campanian man was speaking rapidly, complaining about a delayed shipment of farina flour. Margot had already decoded that farina meant uncut product, likely cocaine. Then the second voice spoke. "Il ponte è chiuso." The man said, his accent clumsy, rounding the vowels too much. "The bridge is closed." "Il vecchio non si muove stanotte." "The old man isn't moving tonight." Margot hit the spacebar, killing the audio. "He just told the men in Italy your uncle's location." Lorenzo stared at the black speakers. "Translate the exact phrasing." "He said the bridge is closed." "In normal Italian it means literally a closed bridge," Margot explained, rubbing her tired eyes. "But he used it as an excuse for why your uncle, the old man, wasn't traveling. It's an American concept shoved into an Italian sentence. He was telling them your uncle was isolated, trapped, and he gave them the timeline. Stanotte. Tonight. Check the timestamp of the recording." Lorenzo ordered, his voice dangerously soft. Margot looked at the digital file data on the monitor. November 12th, 11:40 p.m. Lorenzo closed his eyes. For a fraction of a second, the immaculate, terrifying Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man absorbing a mortal blow. Carlo was killed on the 13th, at 1 in the morning. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced through Margot's exhaustion. The timeline was perfect. The recording wasn't just a business dispute, it was the setup for a murder. She looked at the transcription she had just written out. "The American," Margot said hesitantly, the implication suddenly making her sick to her stomach. He's part of your organization. He's the one who sold your uncle out. Lorenzo opened his eyes. They were completely dead. The bruised earth color had darkened to black. He stood up slowly, picking up his phone from the desk. Did he use a name? Lorenzo asked. No, Margot said, scanning her notes. But the Italian man called him cugino. Cousin, not literally. It's slang. It's what you call someone who handles internal banking. A bookkeeper. Lorenzo didn't say a word. He didn't scream or throw anything. He simply pressed a single button on his phone and lifted it to his ear. The silence in the room stretched brittle and sharp while he waited for the line to connect. Margot watched him, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. She was sitting in the epicenter of a violent earthquake, yet she felt bizarrely untouched by the debris. She had handed him the knife, and now she was watching him decide where to plunge it. Victor, Lorenzo said into the phone. The gravelly rumble of his voice lacked any inflection. Find Peter. Take him to the warehouse on Ogden. Empty his pockets. I'll be there in an hour. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. He looked at Margot. She was clutching the red pen so tightly it was biting into her palm. She knew with absolute certainty that Peter was a dead man. The realization didn't bring the moral panic she expected. Instead, a deeply cynical survivalist instinct flared inside her. The man who ordered Rosa's eviction would have let her grandmother die in the streets. The man in front of her was going to execute a traitor, but he had paid for Rosa's safety. The world was not composed of good and evil anymore. It was just a currency of leverage, and Margot was finally learning how to spend it. Save the file, Lorenzo instructed. He walked over to the coat rack and pulled down his charcoal overcoat. We are done for the day. Exhaustion hit Margot like a physical blow the moment she saved the document and pushed the keyboard away. Her shoulders slumped. The adrenaline that had carried her through the terrifying revelation of the wiretap evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching emptiness. Her mouth tasted like old coffee and copper. Lorenzo was shrugging into his overcoat. He adjusted the collar, his movements precise and unhurried. He didn't look like a man on his way to commit a murder. He looked like an executive leaving a late board meeting. My driver is waiting in the subterranean garage, Lorenzo said. He will take you home. You will be back here at 8 tomorrow morning. Margot stood up. Her legs were shaky, the muscles stiff from sitting in the same rigid posture for 10 hours. She reached for her leather tote bag. It felt 10 times heavier than it had this morning. What happens to him? Margot asked. The words slipped out before she could bite them back. Lorenzo paused his hand, resting on the heavy metal handle of the frosted glass door. He turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. The harsh fluorescent lights caught the silvery scar running through his eyebrow. You translate, Lorenzo said flatly. You don't ask questions about the application of your translations. I have a right to know what I'm a part of. She shot back a sudden spark of defiance, cutting through her fatigue. Lorenzo turned fully around. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, stopping just inches from her. Margot held her ground, refusing to step back, but she had to tilt her head to maintain eye contact. The sheer physical presence of him, the smell of the rain on his coat, the heat radiating off his body was overwhelming. You aren't a part of anything, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You are a civilian who speaks a useful language. Do not confuse your utility with belonging. You do not want to belong to this Margot. He reached out. Margot flinched instinctively, but he didn't strike her. Instead, his large, rough fingers brushed against the collar of her blazer adjusting a fold of the fabric that had gotten caught on her lapel. The gesture was incredibly intimate, entirely contradictory to the violence in his eyes. "Go home," he murmured, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second near the frantic pulse jumping at the base of her throat. "Lock your door. Sleep. When you come back tomorrow, we finish the November ledgers." He dropped his hand and walked out the door, leaving her standing alone in the center of the sterile humming room. The ride back to Logan Square was a blur. The black Lincoln Navigator slid through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago in absolute silence. The driver didn't speak. The privacy partition remained up. Margot stared out the tinted window, watching the neon signs of late-night liquor stores and wet pavement bleed together into abstract smears of color. When the SUV pulled up to her apartment building, the driver finally lowered the glass divider just an inch. "I will be here at 7:45, miss." Margot didn't answer. She climbed out into the freezing rain, pulling her blazer tight across her chest. Her apartment was freezing. The radiator was clanking violently, struggling against the sharp drop in temperature. She didn't turn on the lights. She dropped her bag by the door and walked straight to the bathroom, shedding her clothes in the dark. The hot water of the shower felt like a shock to her system. She stood under the spray until her skin turned pink, scrubbing at her arms and chest with a bar of cheap soap, trying to wash away the smell of the sterile office, the bitter taste of the espresso, and the lingering phantom sensation of Lorenzo's fingers grazing her throat. It didn't work. She wrapped herself in a worn towel and walked into her cramped bedroom. The streetlights outside cast long, skeletal shadows of the fire escape across her faded quilt. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the silence of the apartment pressing in on her. For the last 6 months, this silence had been her enemy. It was the space where her panic attacks bloomed, where she calculated her shrinking bank account and pictured Rosa wandering the streets of Naples. Now the silence was just silence. The crushing debt was gone. The frantic daily terror of being poor and responsible for a dying loved one had been erased by a single phone call from a monster. Margot pulled her knees to her chest, resting her wet forehead against her kneecaps. A dry, jagged sob tore its way out of her throat. She wasn't crying because she was scared. She was crying because she felt safe. It was a vile, toxic kind of safety, purchased with the blood of the men she was helping Lorenzo hunt. She crawled under the cold covers, shivering violently. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep. But every time she drifted off, she heard the thick, guttural dialect of her childhood echoing in her ears, wrapping around her like a chain, pulling her deeper into the dark. Morning arrived, not with sunlight, but with a flat, bruised grey that bled through the cheap plastic blinds. Margot woke, gasping, her sheets tangled around her ankles in a damp knot. The harsh syllables of a Campanian death threat were still dissolving on her tongue, an echo from the nightmares that had chased her through the night. The radiator in the corner was dead quiet. The apartment was freezing. She lay perfectly still for a long time, watching her own breath plume in the cold air, bracing herself for the familiar, crushing panic of her financial ruin to set in. It never came. Instead, a heavy, dark hollow sat right in the center of her chest. Rosa was safe. Peter was dead. Those two absolute facts circled each other like rabid dogs in her mind as she forced herself out of bed. She dressed mechanically. A thick navy wool sweater today, heavy black trousers and boots. It was armor that felt entirely useless. When she stepped out onto the wet sidewalk, the black Lincoln Navigator was already idling by the curb, a thick plume of white exhaust rising into the sleety Chicago air. The driver, the same broad-shouldered man, unlocked the doors with a heavy metallic clunk. He didn't look in the rearview mirror this time. The drive was a silent, grey blur of brake lights and wet asphalt, isolating her completely from the waking city. Subterranean garage, the heavy brass key, the stomach-dropping elevator ride. When the frosted glass doors of the server room parted, the air inside hit her like a physical wall. It felt thick, saturated, with the harsh, stinging bite of industrial bleach, stale black coffee, and a faint coppery tang that made the hair on her arm stand up. Lorenzo was not sitting at the black glass desk. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the storm battering the city skyline. He looked ruined. The immaculate, terrifying executive from yesterday had been completely stripped away. He wore the same dark trousers, but his crisp white dress shirt was untucked, the top 3 buttons torn open to expose a bruised, discolored patch of skin near his collarbone. His sleeves were rolled up tightly past his elbows. His forearms were covered in dark, intricate ink that looked stark and violent under the harsh fluorescent lighting. But it was his hands that made Margot's breath catch in her throat. His knuckles weren't just split anymore. They were a deep, mottled purple, the skin swollen raw and newly broken. Margot stopped just inside the doorway. The instinct to run flared bright and hot, a biological alarm screaming in her brain. She could smell the violence on him from across the room. It wasn't a metaphor. It was real, tangible, and terrifying. "You're early," Lorenzo rasped. His voice was scraped raw, sounding like dragged gravel. He didn't turn around. "Traffic was light," Margot replied. Her voice trembled, betraying the sheer icy terror spiking through her veins. He finally turned. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with deep, bruised shadows of absolute exhaustion. He looked at her, his gaze dropping to the heavy leather tote bag, clutched defensively against her stomach, then rising slowly to her pale face. There was no triumph in his expression, no psychotic cinematic glee. He just looked impossibly tired, a man carrying the crushing weight of a butcher's bill. He walked toward the desk, his movements stiff and heavy. He didn't offer her a polite command to sit. Instead, he picked up a heavy white ceramic mug from the edge of the glass and held it out to her. Margot stared at it. "I don't drink it," Lorenzo interrupted quietly. "Black. 3 sugars. You looked like a ghost when you walked out of here last night." She stepped forward, her hand shaking so badly she nearly spilled it as she took the mug. Their fingers brushed. His skin was ice-cold rough, like coarse sandpaper. A violent shiver racked her spine, completely unrelated to the temperature of the room. She took a sip. It was scalding, overwhelmingly sweet, and exactly what her crashing system needed. The bitter irony of the gesture tasted like ash in her mouth. He had spent the night beating a man to death, and then he had remembered exactly how she took her coffee. Margot set her bag down and pulled out her worn notebooks. She moved to her chair and sat staring at the blank sleeping monitors. The studio headphones sat waiting, coiled like a black serpent on the desk. "Is it done?" she whispered. She hated herself for asking. She didn't want the confirmation, yet the words spilled out anyway, driven by a morbid, terrifying curiosity. Lorenzo sank heavily into the chair across from her. He braced his elbows on the desk, resting his forehead against his bruised, swollen fists. Peter had a gambling debt. 50,000 to a bookie in Cicero. The men in Campania offered to clear it in exchange for Carlo's schedule. They bought him. $50,000. That was the price of a life in this room. Margot felt a sickening twist in her gut. She had sold her soul for 12. "He begged," Lorenzo said, his voice muffled behind his hands. "He cried. He swore on his mother's life. He didn't know they would kill Carlo. He thought it was just a robbery. Margot stared at the top of Lorenzo's head. The ruthless, untouchable boss was cracking just a fraction, leaking the toxic poison of his world onto the glass desk between them. She should be horrified. She should throw the hot coffee in his face and run for the elevator. But the cynical hardened core inside her, the part that had fought tooth and nail, lying and screaming to keep Rosa alive, understood the brutal transactional nature of what had just happened. Peter made a trade. He lost. Margot reached out. Her hand hovered in the air for a second, trembling violently, before she gently laid her fingers over the coiled wire of the headphones. "We have work to do," Margot said softly. Her voice was steady now, the tremor completely gone, replaced by a cold, frightening calm. Lorenzo slowly raised his head. His dark eyes locked onto hers, searching her face for the revulsion, the moral panic, the desperate tears he expected. He didn't find them. Instead, he found a woman who had finally stopped pretending she didn't belong in the dark. He reached out his bruised, battered knuckles, grazing the back of her hand as he tapped the keyboard, waking the monitors. The harsh blue light bathed them both in the same cold, unforgiving glow. November 13th. Lorenzo murmured, his eyes never leaving hers. "Let's find the men who paid him."